Before you decide what kind of mother I was, listen to this. I was the kind of woman who made pancakes every Sunday, who kept a fountain pen in the breast pocket of her cardigan, who smiled at the neighbors' lilies and remembered birthdays by the weight of a watch against my wrist. I was 62 when my son dropped a suitcase on the linoleum of Willow Pines and walked out. I know that sounds like a headline and not a life, but you had to be there to understand the particular smallness of it, the click of that hard plastic handle, the stale perfume that clung to the fabric, the look he gave me, a luckless practiced tenderness that cost him nothing. He said, "It's for the best, Mom. They'll look after you." Then he touched my cheek as if he'd been the one to fold me into a paper towel and toss me away. Stick around till the end and tell me where you're watching from. If you've been through something like this, I want to know your name. If you haven't, please stay. There's a part of this story that you won't expect. A single piece of paper, a week, and the way my life, the life they thought they'd renamed for me, unraveled. We lived in a narrow house on a corner in Dayton that smelled like coffee in the morning and lemon oil at night. I had lived there 30 years. My kitchen window saw every season of my life. I raised my boy on peanut butter sandwiches and second-hand dresses, washing and mending until the seams called uncle. Brandon was bright. He could light up a room with a grin and make people forget what they owed him. He was also very good at telling stories about himself, half of which he seemed to begin in order to end with some favor he expected. The slow erosion started with favors. "Can you loan me some cash until payday?" he'd say, and I would think of his childhood scraped knees and the way he'd asked for just one more chance, once, twice, a dozen times. When my husband died, Brandon stepped into the role he'd rehearsed so often. He sorted a few bills, pressed my suitcases into the attic, smiled while rearranging my accounts under the soft lie of help. He told me he would take care of everything. I thought my son was looking out for me. I thought we were rewriting the story of our lives toward gentler days. What I didn't know was that in the months before Willow Pines, he had begun to call my attention away from things I had kept for years. "Oh, Mom, you don't need that old lottery ticket," he said once, folding a faded paper into his hand with that casual charm he used when he wanted me distracted. It was ridiculous of him, but I was tired that day and wanted to be agreeable, so I let him. That ticket had lived in the lining of a shoebox under the bed for nearly a year, an impulsive glance at a counter while we were out, a scratch card purchased on a whim. It was a small physics of memory and luck I never thought would figure into the rest of my life. On the day he left me, the room at Willow Pines smelled like bleach and canned peaches. The lights were too bright, and the clock on the wall found new ways to clink at the corners of my ears. I had the suitcase with me, the suitcase he'd set down himself, and nothing else that mattered. There was a single framed photograph of us on the dresser, my husband's laugh forever frozen, Brandon with an arm slung around his shoulder. I knew then that this could be the version of my life someone else would write if I let them. I met Ruby in the dining room over watered coffee. Ruby was a staff aide, small, quick-handed, and unusually blunt. She had a way of seeing through the polite scripts people used and saying the thing that made you feel seen. "You don't belong here," she said to me over a bowl of hospital jello that had the timid sheen of gelatin and the honest smell of sugar. Her voice had a Tennessee lilt. She told me her mother had been through something similar. It was both the wrong and the right thing to say. Ruby would become the hinge. She noticed how I kept fingering the pen tucked into my cardigan. She watched me trace the scar on the inside of my wrist where years before I'd cut myself on a tin lid. She asked quiet questions that belonged more to empathy than to procedure. Do you want to get your things? Do you have anyone who visits? When she heard Brandon, her eyes did one of those small shifts people do when they've read a story before. She started bringing me small comforts, a lemon cookie she'd stolen from the staff room, a magazine with crossword puzzles, a knitted shawl that smelt faintly of her shampoo. It was Ruby who found the ticket. We were clearing the drawer in the bedside table, trying to make the place feel less like an institution and more like a temporary way station. I'd been looking for the fountain pen I carried for luck, but instead my hand brushed a stiff corner of paper tucked under a stack of grocery lists. It was brittle and had turned a faint tea color where the years had stained it. My heart did something I hadn't felt in a long time, a small, alarmed joy. And when I unfolded it, there were numbers on it that meant nothing until Ruby tapped the TV and turned to the lottery bulletin. "They haven't claimed the winter jackpot," she said. The numbers on the screen and the numbers on my ticket matched in a way that made the room tilt. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. The dining room became a room from a film where sound slows and everybody starts to move in a different key. I held the card in both hands and felt the paper become heavier. There is a shame in joy when it arrives like a thunderclap. Shame because everything before it had the shape of poverty, the softening of friendships, the paperwork, the way people stopped asking me to dinner. I thought, of course, of Brandon. I thought, if he took this, I would not be surprised. It was the same person. By the time Ruby and I sat at the telephone, I was trying to steady my voice and failing. She had a levelness I admired. She suggested quietly that we call the lottery office, that I should hold on to the ticket, that maybe we should not tell anyone yet. The practicalness of it soothed something in me. But even then, I knew a phone call could be intercepted, a signature could be forged, a document could be buried. That night, in the bad light between sleep and sleeplessness, I remembered the fireproof box hidden beneath the loose floorboard under my dresser, a box my husband had bought for peace of mind and then never used the way he intended. I remembered the soft scrape of his hand when he'd tucked letters into an envelope and hid it away for a rainy day. I had not thought to check it in months. All the small artifacts of a life had become scattered in his absence like shells on a shore. I slept poorly and woke with the ticket folded against my palm like a confession. I called my bank from the facility phone and asked for copies of my statements over the past year. That is when things started to thicken. There were withdrawals I did not remember authorizing, checks written in my name I did not remember signing, transfers into accounts with names I had never heard. The lines on the paper blurred as if the ink wanted to flee. The staff at Willow Pines were not all indifferent. A nurse named Gloria brought me a mug of tea and sat while I told her what I'd found. She listened with the kind of attention that makes you feel less like a story and more like a person. "We've seen it happen," she said. "Adult children think they know what's best. They sign papers, call it planning." She didn't know that my son had shadows where his sermons had been, small thefts dressed up as loans, gentle threats when boundaries were suggested. But she'd seen the aftermath enough to recognize the pattern. I told her about the loose floorboard. I told her about the ticket. By the time Ruby and I had hired a young paralegal named Aaron, he volunteered with a local legal aid clinic that took cases nobody else wanted. Things had become a tangle of human embarrassment and procedural dread. Aaron was steady-eyed and practical in a way that made me feel less like a defendant and more like a client of my own life. He asked for lists. He explained things in sentences that did not try to impress me. "We can petition to halt transfers and secure the funds for the ticket," he said carefully. And I must admit, I felt a flash of hope. But it came tethered to another fear. Making any move at all would light up Brandon like a moth to a porch. He had already started turning my name into a headline, friends and acquaintances receiving calls where he used gentle drama to justify his decisions. "She needs round-the-clock care," he'd tell them, voice soft with manufactured concern. I began to build a folder. There were photocopies of bills addressed to me that had moved to other addresses, a faded power of attorney form with a signature that did not feel like mine, and tucked into a thick envelope, the ticket. I placed the ticket in a small envelope that could fit in the palm of my hand and slid it into my bra under the knitted shawl Ruby had brought that day. It felt ridiculous and primal to hide a piece of paper the way one hides an heirloom. We started quietly. Aaron filed a motion to freeze suspicious transfers and sought a temporary restraining order against anyone moving funds or forcing changes in my accounts. He got an appointment with Dr. Levine, an independent psychiatrist who did capacity assessments for a living. Dr. Levine was precise and gentle, asking me about the past week, about how I made decisions, about whether I remembered signing certain documents. He took my handwriting sample and matched it against things the bank had flagged. When he said quietly in his office that the signatures on several documents did not rise to the level of mine, it sounded like music. But legal steps have a rhythm of their own. They are both slow and urgent. Court schedules, clerks, filings that must be on paper in a way that asks for proof and patience. I was not at the center of a single cinematic courtroom drama yet. I was at the edges of hearings, leaning in to hear when the judge might issue a stay or when the sheriff might enforce a petition. I took the bus back to my house one day, my suitcase in the overhead rack, and looked at the neighborhoods go by. The maple trees in late autumn, the corner barber shop, the woman on the porch braiding. I felt both small and newly anchored. The ticket in my bra hummed like a live wire. Then Brandon came by. He had not been around for weeks, and when he arrived, he brought a tray of takeout and a charm that read "sorry" in cheap script. He sat on the edge of the bed in my old house while I sipped oversweet tea and watched him recite the version of events he wanted the world to hold. He spoke of my frailty with a performance I would later recognize in his public statements, a softness that was calibrated to disarm. "You must trust me," he said, as if I had never taught him how to use the word. When I asked him about the ticket, his eyes did the little thing people do when they are caught. They blinked fast, and for a second, the boy beneath the polished man blinked too. He mumbled something about having thrown out junk, about how I wouldn't need little papers like that. He laughed once, 2 notes too high. I wanted to call him out, to demand the ticket, to make him confess, but I also wanted to see if he would feel shame. He did not. What he felt was annoyance that his plan might be disrupted. He laughed as he always did, the door clicking like a coin fall. It was Ruby who told me to check the fireproof box properly. "It's the places people hide truth," she said, tapping her nose. We pried up the loose board together with the kind of clumsy tenderness of two women who have learned to navigate spaces that were not designed for their agency. Under the floor, wrapped in an old dish towel, was a small, dented tin. Inside the tin were letters, a few old stamps, my husband's watch that no longer ran, and, beneath everything, the same shoebox with the inside lining turned soft with age. My hands trembled so badly that the ticket slipped and fluttered across the floor like a moth fleeing a lamp. I caught it and held it to my chest until the room calmed. Aaron prepared the claim. He explained, in the matter-of-fact way of people who have seen too many lives frayed by money, that claims for large prizes require identification and paperwork and sometimes anonymity if you can arrange it. "We'll be careful," he said. "We will do this in a way that keeps you safe." I believed him then, in the pragmatic way one trusts someone holding a rope. We filed the necessary notices, keeping the ticket secure in a safety deposit box under Aaron's supervision until we could make a plan. When the news of my ticket leaked, someone at the facility must have seen the envelope, or Brandon had his own ways. My phone began to ring. Messages arrived with that odd mix of pity and curiosity that reads like a public mirror. Sarah, a reporter from the local paper, called and asked if I was willing to speak. "Only if it will help," I told her. She came with a notebook and a carefulness I didn't expect from someone who made a living on leads. She listened to the story and said simply, "People need to know how this happens." Her article ran with a headline that made my stomach quake. "An old woman, a disputed ticket, a son's questionable guardianship." It made people choose sides. Brandon reacted badly. He began to file documents, claiming that my decision-making was impaired, that I was vulnerable to scams, that he had only my best interests at heart. He petitioned the court for temporary guardianship, a paper sword he used as if it gave him right to the rest of my days. He put my face into the language of protection, while his actions suggested a desire for control. Friends and neighbors who had once seen him as a boy with a sweet tooth began to whisper. That's when the fight escalated outward into places I had not imagined. Aaron, who had spent more time than he could have hoped on pro bono work, connected me with a senior advocate network. Through them, Dr. Levine's report, and Aaron's steady, step-by-step filings, we were able to bring the matter into the public eye with weight behind it. The court agreed to a hearing to evaluate the guardianship petition and to consider whether the alleged transfers were bona fide. Brandon, on the other hand, began to use social media. He posted photographs of me smiling, captions about care, about responsibility, about sacrifice. He curated an image of himself that made him look like a man burdened by love. There were humiliations. In a preliminary hearing, I sat in a community courtroom with linoleum floors and the smell of old coffee. There were people in suits whose shoes made sharp sounds on tile. Brandon's lawyer stood and spoke of my welfare with a precision designed to make me sound fragile and grateful. I felt the weight of being observed, cataloged, evaluated in a way that reduced my personhood to a series of lines on a legal sheet. I wanted to stand up and tell them about the way my hands still remembered how to cook, how to fix a loose hem, how to choose a card for a friend. I wanted to tell them that the ticket was a ridiculous thing to stake everything on, and also the only unmediated truth I had been able to salvage. Here is something I should have known earlier. Vindication is not a single moment. It is a series of small confirmations. It is the sheriff's deputy who, after speaking to Aaron, shows up at the nursing home and requests to see the paperwork. It is the bank freezing a suspicious transfer after the auditors take another look. It is the anonymous tip that reaches a federal office concerned with financial exploitation of elders. Those confirmations accumulate like coins in a jar. They give weight to your claim in ways the law can weigh. When the Department of Justice opened a preliminary inquiry into transactions flagged by the bank, the story widened beyond a courtroom drama and into investigative territory. The investigators asked for more records. They wanted to talk to neighbors and to anyone who had seen Brandon's behavior around money. That, more than anything, changed the tenor of what was happening. Brandon's confident smile began to crumble the way old plaster does when water finds its way in. For all his performance, he had not counted on paperwork that could be traced, the small, merciless arithmetic of receipts and timestamps. And then, the week that made the headline true. A week after he left me at Willow Pines, the state lottery office confirmed the claim. The ticket was valid. The prize, enough to change the shape of my life, was finally mine, legally and unquestionably mine. The sensation of being a millionaire was almost absurd in its banality. The paper in the vault became numbers in an account, and those numbers, contracted into zeros and commas, began to represent not only wealth, but a kind of safety. What I did with that money mattered in more ways than one. Brandon tried to stake a claim. He petitioned again, this time with evidence he hoped would suggest a new narrative, that the ticket was his, that he had purchased it in my name, a well-timed lie that would have the benefit of appearing generous. Aaron and I prepared for that possibility with Dr. Levine's assessment, with testimony from Ruby about the timing of his visits, with statements from neighbors who had seen him remove boxes from my house. The case that would make or break my autonomy was not just about the ticket. It was about who I was permitted to be at the end of my life. There are moments in a trial when time moves in an odd way. The morning of the hearing, we sat in a corridor outside a courtroom, my cardigan around my shoulders and my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that was already cold. Ruby patted my knee and said, "You got this." Aaron went over the sequence of documents once more, eyes tired but precise. The corridor smelled faintly of cleaning solvent and the old leather of the courthouse chairs. When the judge called the case, my chest tightened in a way that felt like holding my breath. Brandon's lawyer was slick. He had a way of folding facts into a story that made them look less sharp. He argued that my memory was faulty, that my son had acted in my best interest, that the evidence was ambiguous. But here is the other side of what they don't tell you about legal fights. They are won in the slow accumulation of small admissible truths. Dr. Levine's testimony about capacity, the handwriting analysis that showed discrepancies, the bank statements that traced transfers to an account in Brandon's name. These things filed themselves into a picture the judge could not easily dismiss. There was a defining moment when Sarah, the reporter, entered a new document into the public conversation. She had been following the story and had done her own digging. She published a piece that included statements from other families who had been touched by similar patterns. The Senate's local council picked up the trail. The public pressure made the institution in which I had been placed take another look at their release procedures. The combination of private evidence and public pressure created a tide. The judge's ruling was not a fanfare. It was a precise judicial sound that in its way felt like music. A denial of Brandon's petition for guardianship, an order to unfreeze certain funds for my immediate care, and a directive for a fuller civil inquiry. Brandon reacted with fury and a pleading that felt like a performance. His jaw worked, and he spoke of his love for me with a voice that sought to redeem him in the room. I think now he believed that if he could narrate the loss he had caused into a narrative of sacrifice, he could scrub himself clean. He could not. The federal inquiry grew. Agents came with badges and flat eyes and questions that did not seek to console, but to document. They traced transfers to accounts that had been opened under names that were convenient fronts. They examined notarized forms signed in shaky curlicues, and they looked at leases and invoices that had no business. In one of those small ironies life sometimes delivers, the very neatness of Brandon's social media footprint, his careful photos, the receipts he had kept to prove his caretaking, provided a trail. Humans leave trails when they try to do a thing perfectly. I am not telling you this to revel in the downfall of my child. The heart is complicated. There are mornings when I look at an old photograph and feel both the ache of loss and the flicker of tenderness. He was once the boy who chased fireflies in the yard, who tucked my hair behind my ear. But the person who left the suitcase on my bed and then tried to take my ticket was making choices I could not be made to accept. Justice in my case was not vengeance, it was a reclamation of dignity. Once the funds were secured, I made decisions that surprised even me. I bought back the house I had imagined losing and painted the kitchen the bright, stubborn yellow my husband had always loved. I kept a small portion for myself to live in comfort, because comfort after indignity is a form of repair. But the rest I used to start a modest foundation focused on elder financial protection. It was called The Watch. The name came from my husband's broken watch that we had found under the floorboard, and its mission was simple: education, legal aid, and a hotline for people who suspected their loved ones were exploiting elders. Starting the foundation was hard work, and it made me wake up some mornings as if I had a new job. I sat in small rooms with volunteers and lawyers with Ruby at my side, and we talked about leaflets and workshops and legal clinics. We partnered with Sarah's newsroom on a series of public stories that did not sensationalize, but explained softly and plainly the signs of elder financial abuse. We made sure the hotline told people what they could do when they suspected something, how to document, whom to call, without instructing anyone on how to commit a crime. The mission was to make it harder for people like Brandon to find camouflage. Brandon's legal troubles continued. The DOJ's interest became public, and later there was an indictment on charges that included exploitation and fraud. The courtroom drama that followed was not cathartic in the way films promise. It was tedious, necessary, and humane in its own way. Testimony, depositions, the slow grinding of evidence into a form that courts could adjudicate. His face in the dock was not dramatic. He looked like a man who had finally been named for what he had done. When it was over, when the judge read the sentence and the words had their weight, I sat with a photograph in my hand, the one with my husband and my boy on the porch, the three of us a frozen narrative of a time before choices hardened into crimes. I placed the photograph in the fireplace one late autumn evening. It burned quietly, a small, clean surrender. I felt a mournful lightness. Some people call it closure. Others call it release. For me, it was both. The Watch, my foundation, began to grow in modest, stubborn ways. We ran workshops at senior centers about suspicious transactions. We partnered with pro bono lawyers like Aaron, who could take on cases where elders were being preyed upon. Brandon's legal troubles continued. The DOJ's interest became public, and later there was an indictment on charges that included exploitation and fraud. The courtroom drama that followed was not cathartic in the way films promise. It was tedious, necessary, and humane in its own way. Testimony, depositions, the slow grinding of evidence into a form that courts could adjudicate. His face in the dock was not dramatic. He looked like a man who had finally been named for what he had done. When it was over, when the judge read the sentence and the words had their weight, I sat with a photograph in my hand, the one with my husband and my boy on the porch, the three of us a frozen narrative of a time before choices hardened into crimes. I placed the photograph in the fireplace one late autumn evening. It burned quietly, a small, clean surrender. I felt a mournful lightness. Some people call it closure. Others call it release. For me, it was both. The watch, my foundation, began to grow in modest, stubborn ways. We ran workshops at senior centers about suspicious transactions. We partnered with pro bono lawyers like Aaron, who could take on cases where elders were being preyed upon. We worked to create lobby packets for legislators who wanted to strengthen reporting requirements and protections. It did not feel like heroism because it was hard and slow and bureaucratic and real. It felt like the day-by-day work of repairing a thing that had been broken in ways both public and private. There were moments of sweetness, too. Doris, an old roommate from the Willow Pines days who had become my friend, came over for tea and told me about the roses she planted. Ruby married a man from Tennessee and sent me a sweater that smelt like her shampoo. Sarah kept writing pieces that pushed the conversation forward, and readers wrote in with their stories, some of apology, others of relief, many of solidarity. People from towns I had never seen sent small checks and notes and offers to volunteer. The money had given me the space to listen to people in ways I had not been able to before. I do not claim that everything became simple. There are quiet hours when I still miss the child who once clambered on my lap. There are days when the house is too big and my hands miss the habit of folding laundry in the company of someone who once did not take the world for granted. But I have a sense now of boundaries I did not have before. I know the difference between responsible care and possession. I know how to say no and mean it. If you are listening because you or someone you love has been taken advantage of by a trusted family member, I want you to know two things. Secrecy is the friend of exploitation, and speaking quietly and with proof can be a way to make change. That does not mean it is easy. It means you will likely need allies. For me, Ruby's small acts of noticing, Aaron's steady hand in the paperwork, Dr. Levine's medical clarity, Sarah's public platform, and the stubbornness of a system that still, in places, values evidence over charisma. That network is what held me. There is one last image I keep returning to, a small tin under a loose floorboard, my fingers prying at wood that had been meant to conceal and became a gateway to truth. It is the same hand that held the lottery ticket, that signed the first checks when my husband was alive, that learned to stand up in a courtroom and say, "This is mine." I closed the foundation with a small ceremony in the kitchen, with lemon cookies and a pot of coffee that tasted like ordinary mornings. We read letters from people we'd helped and from families who now knew how to look for small red flags before they became disasters. I do not want pity. I do not want your surprise. I want what any woman does when she survives, to be acknowledged, to be heard, to be allowed the dignity of choosing how to live the rest of her life. Money, suddenly becoming a millionaire, was not the point in the end. It was a tool, a means, a way to lift myself out of a vulnerability that had been exploited. It allowed me to set the terms on which I would live and to try and make sure fewer people would have to learn the hard way what I learned. If you're still with me, if you read this and felt your breath catch at some point, please tell me where you're watching from in the comments below. If something in this touched you, share the story. If you know someone who needs help, reach out quietly and offer them the number to an elder protection hotline or a local legal clinic. I started the watch with a modest pot of money and a stubborn heart. More than anything, it needs people willing to look and act. There's more to the story: the courtroom transcripts, the phone calls I won't repeat here, the odd kindness of a mailman who testified on my behalf. But I'll tell you that the suitcase still exists in my attic, dented and faded, no longer containing me. The fireproof box is now a shrine of sorts. It holds letters I have kept for the purposes of memory and witness, not for loss. And sometimes, when the house is quiet, I take the old fountain pen out of my cardigan and write to people who need to know they are not alone. If you have a story like this, or even a small piece of it, tell it where someone can help. If you want to support elder protection work, look for organizations in your area that provide legal help, advocate for policy changes, and run educational programs. You do not need to be rich to make that difference. Sometimes a few hours of attention is the most valuable currency. I am not a hero. I am a woman who refused to be small when a smallness was being assigned to her. I am also someone who learned that money can buy a kind of breathing room, and with that breathing room comes responsibility. I hope my story gives you both the outrage and the blueprint to care in the way you need to care. There's an email Aaron just forwarded me. It's from a federal agent with a new note about the case. I need to read it now. I'll tell you what happens next. The subject line was spare. Update Case 17-462. I clicked before Aaron reached the kitchen. The email was from Special Agent Morales, typed with the brisk punctuation of someone who had learned to be efficient with other people's time and pain. They'd found a pattern. 2 bank accounts in a neighboring state, small monthly transfers labeled caretaker stipend that had been routed through a shell company, a cashier's check mailed to a storage unit that matched the description of the old metal suitcase, a signed affidavit from a teller who remembered the man who always wore the same coat and paid in cash. Morales asked if I could come to the field office for an interview and whether I would be willing to testify before a grand jury. There was a line offering witness protection options I did not expect to need: anonymity in court filings, pseudonymous affidavits. It read like careful scaffolding for someone who had been taught to believe that silence kept them safe. My hands were steady as I read. My heart was not. I sat at the kitchen table with the corner of an envelope cupped in my palm like a talisman. The pencil marks of a child's grocery list from years ago were half erased on a second sheet. Ruby set a plate of lemon cookies beside my coffee and didn't ask for an explanation. She had learned to make space for the unsaid. "I'll go," I told Aaron when he wandered in, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He folded the email on his phone and read it as if the words were physical objects that could be handled carefully. "You'll need the notebooks," he said, "the ledger copies, the copies we made for Sarah, everything in the fireproof box. Morales will want originals if they're admissible. I pictured the box beneath the kitchen sink where I had hidden it for months, then moved to the closet and placed it on the counter before I could think twice. The old fountain pen fit into my palm like a bone. It had bled in a letter that began with "My dearest" and ended with a signature that had been signed for me more times than I could count. The pen had been mine to use again. At the field office, the fluorescent lights smelled like other people's urgency. Agent Morales was younger than I expected and older in the way of people who had been doing difficult things for a long time. He had a soft way of asking questions and a hard folder of evidence that made the soft questions matter. He listened as I told him what I had told no one else, pulling small things from my memory. A signature that wavered when I held the check up to the light. The way my brother-in-law's laugh had filled a room and convinced people not to look too closely. "These patterns," he said, spreading copies of bank statements across the table, "they're not just about one person. There's a network. We've identified a power of attorney signature that appears on care plan changes for 3 different clients with different last names. Same handwriting, same slanted R." Hearing the word network tightened a muscle at the base of my neck. Predators who work in groups, predators who learned from each other. But there was also justice inside that discovery, a map to follow. Morales proposed the grand jury because the federal statutes for mail and wire fraud would let prosecutors treat the exploitation as more than a family quarrel. "We can put statutes beneath the story," he said. "We can make it matter in a courtroom." I agreed. The attorney he assigned, Marta Klein, was a small, fierce woman who had a laugh like a door opening. She taught me to practice saying what happened without the anger I still felt at being rendered fragile by someone who had no right to name me anything. "We testify to the facts," she said. "We let the rest of it land on them." I agreed. The attorney he assigned, Marta Klein, was a small, fierce woman who had a laugh like a door opening. She taught me to practice saying what happened without the anger I still felt at being rendered fragile by someone who had no right to name me anything. "We testify to the facts," she said. "We let the rest of it land on them." Preparation was a ritual. We went through the ledger line by line. We rebuilt the timeline the way one sews back a torn garment. Nick by careful nick, thread matched to thread. Aaron sat through hours of it, his shoulders calm and patient in a way I had come to trust like an anchor. Ruby arranged a small pile of cookies and littered the table with Post-its labeled dates, checks, witnesses. We practiced a short statement for TV, if it came to that, then rehearsed the honest, dry descriptions that would be useful to investigators. On the day I testified before the grand jury, I wore the cardigan I had chosen months earlier for no reason but its color, a soft gray that didn't draw attention. The courthouse was a building of stone and echo. The marble hallway swallowed our footsteps. I felt small in the way I had once been small, until I opened my mouth. The jury was a ring of faces behind a wood-paneled barrier. I spoke into a microphone because that's what the room required, and at first my voice felt like someone else's, but then it steadied. I described the tin under the floorboard and the letters in the fireproof box. I read aloud the way the checks were made out, the odd increments that matched how a caretaker might siphon off small amounts to avoid immediate questions. I handed over copies of the notebook in which I had once tracked pills and phone calls, trivial things that can become a pattern. At one point, a juror, a woman with reading glasses, asked for clarification about how I had learned the handwriting was false. I explained the way signatures repeat, the tiny curlicues and the pressure at the bottom of an S. It was a strange intimacy to make handwriting into evidence of intention. It stood out because it was wrong in the places I knew how it should be right, I said. That was how I knew he had been writing my life for me. People in the room took notes. Agent Morales watched with a presence like a lighthouse in fog. When I left, I understood that the web we had been tangled in was now a line of cases that could be pulled at. The grand jury's decision to issue indictments felt in a private way like the first untying of a knot that had been tightened for years. But indictments are not cures. They are instruments. They require proof. They require stamina. They require people to show up. The trial date came in winter. Snow clung to the courthouse steps and made the city look like a photograph that had been carefully staged. The defendant, my husband's brother, sat with his hands folded tight. He wore the same coat I'd seen in bank surveillance photos, but on his face there was a practiced expression of bewilderment that read, "Who would do this to a kind man?" The defense tried every line they had. He was the wronged one, they said. He had been taking care of a man in decline and needed funds to cover costs. He offered character witnesses who spoke about his easy laugh and his history of generosity. He smiled in a way that made jurors remember conversations at barbecues instead of the ledger we had brought to the courtroom. Marta held the prosecution with a quiet ferocity. She worked through the trail of transactions as if laying stone. This check here, this signature there, this forged document that changed the terms of a power of attorney. We called the bank teller who had remembered the man in the coat. We subpoenaed the storage unit records. The metal suitcase, tattered and dented, exactly as I'd described, came into evidence with a strip of police tape across its latch. The sight of it in the courtroom made something ancestral unclench in me. On cross-examination, the defense counsel tried to paint me as unreliable, a grieving widow, a woman who had suffered loss and whose recollections might be skewed. The older tactic of discrediting the messenger rather than the message. I listened, and then I said slowly, I kept records. I have bank statements. I have copies. I brought them here. I did not trust my own memory until I had paper to match it to. The judge's face was unreadable, but the jury's faces were not. Some of them looked as if they had been given a small light behind the ribs. There were moments when the past crowded into the present so hard that I had to breathe through it. A question about a canceled check made my hands remember the tremor they had when I discovered the first missing withdrawal. A photograph was shown of the two of us on a fishing trip, smiling and sunburned. It was used to suggest harmony. It was a terrible, tidy abuse, using affection as a shield. When the verdict came back, it felt both enormous and unfinishable, guilty on multiple counts. The jurors had listened to ledgers and signatures and the small, stubborn truth that someone had been treated as property. The sentencing was less satisfying than the verdict's moral clarity. Restitution was ordered, but limited by law. The man received jail time, and the judge's remarks were balanced between condemnation and an oddly perfunctory appeal to rehabilitation. It was enough in that moment to feel that the law had recognized my personhood. The aftermath was work. We used the modest restitution to expand the Watch's hotline, to fund a small fellowship for community educators to go into senior centers, to print pamphlets that looked less like warnings and more like permission to ask hard questions. Sarah ran a piece that avoided salacious detail and focused on resources. People wrote in with their own stories. Ruby and I started training sessions at the local library, teaching others how to keep records and how to spot the small incremental shifts that often precede catastrophe. There were private things that the conviction did not fix. The way rooms contain ghosts, the habit of checking the back seat as if someone might be there. But there was also a lightness, a sort of gravitational reorientation toward agency. One morning, some months after the sentencing, a woman came to our training with her hands clasped like someone holding on to a lifeline. She had the sort of tiredness that comes from years of caretaking. She listened as the workshop circled through the basics, ask for copies of financial statements, insist on separate accounts, never sign a power of attorney without independent counsel. She waited until the end and then knocked on the table. "I don't have proof," she said. "He says it's for his medicines, but my sister's checking account shows small withdrawals. I don't know what to do." I saw in her face the moment that had once been mine, the fragile hairline between doubt and action. I told her what I had been told. Secrecy is a friend of exploitation. Speak quietly and bring copies. I gave her the number for our hotline and the name of the clinic that would take pro bono elder representation cases. She left with a folder Ruby had made, simple templates, a list of questions for banks, a short script for asking uncomfortable things. When she hugged me, she smelled like winter coats and peppermint gum. It was a small human contact that felt like a promise. There are still things I do not say aloud. There are letters I keep sealed, not as relics of loss, but as artifacts of survival. The fireproof box stays on a low shelf now. It is a repository not of shame, but of witness. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I open it and read a line or two from a letter and feel the shape of my life rearrange itself into something I chose. People ask me now what changed me most. The answer is both ordinary and stubborn. Boundaries. Saying no without apologizing. Teaching others to speak the names of their concerns. Listening when someone else tells a small story that could become a pattern. The watch remains modest in its funding and ambitious in its aims. We are not a charity that distributes hope as a product. We are neighbors who have learned to look and to act. A month after the trial, Agent Morales sent another brief note. There were other leads in adjacent counties. His team wanted to meet with our volunteers to plan a community outreach in those areas. He included a list of resources and a suggested schedule. I read it at the kitchen table with a pen and a Post-it, and I wrote back, "Yes, we'll come. Bring coffee." There will be more cases, I know. There will be nights when I still wake and think I need to count pills, and mornings when the house is too loud with nothing. But there is also a new cadence now. Meetings, trainings, letters from people who say they were saved from a small, creeping theft because someone asked the right question. That is the work of repair. Sometimes, when people ask me about courage, I think of that tin under the floorboard, not because it was heroic, but because it was the place where concealment ended and light began to enter. Small acts of noticing, handed from one person to another, are how communities save themselves. I keep the fountain pen in my cardigan pocket. It is no longer an instrument of evidence, but of contact. I use it to write to survivors, brief notes of encouragement, lists of resources, sometimes a sentence that says simply, "You are not alone." The letters are not meant to be dramatic. They are meant to be practical and warm, a small dish of lemon cookies passed over a table. They are meant to say to someone who has been made small, "You are allowed to be whole again." The Watch has a modest office above a dry cleaner on Main Street. The first time I walked up the narrow steps to the door with Sarah by my side, the smell of chemical solvent and coffee mingled in a way that felt like a new beginning. We pinned a small plaque by the window, the words simple and deliberate. The Watch. Aid, education, advocacy. People come in with ledger paper, with photos, with messy letters. They sit at our chairs, and someone, sometimes me, sometimes a volunteer, listens. Tonight, I will answer a message that arrived an hour ago from a woman in a town 3 states away. Her email is brief. I found my mother's mail opened. I can't make sense of the bills. I have learned to start with 2 questions. Where are you now? Who is with you? After that, the work is methodical. How to secure records, how to get them to safety, how to insist on paper when paper matters. There is an economy to care that cannot be monetized. It starts with attention and moves incrementally towards safety. We teach people to value their own attention. We teach communities to be neighboring watchers. And when a prosecutor in a courthouse reads a ledger and says, "This is theft," those quiet acts of noticing are finally given the language of law. I still keep the old suitcase in the attic. It is lighter now, the bulwark of a chapter closed but not erased. Sometimes Ruby climbs up and brings it down so we can look at the dents, the faded sticker from a motel we once loved. We touch it like a relic of the life that almost owned me. I close the lid and we set it by the door, a reminder that things that once contained us can be put away. There will be other letters to write, other courtrooms to enter, other warmed hands to hold. Both are true. Both belong. I am reading another email now, this one from a woman who found our pamphlet at a bus stop and wants to volunteer. Ruby is knitting by the window and humming a tune she learned from her grandmother. Aaron is at his desk, head bent, writing a grant proposal that could fund a small expansion of our hotline. There is work to be done. There are lives to be noticed.